It brings us to the big final thing that I want to talk about today. It is massively important just in the world and also to me. And it starts with the fact that no sitting justice on the Georgia Supreme Court has lost re-election since 1922. And it's also not a uniquely Georgia thing. Across all 13 states that pick their justices through nonpartisan elections, incumbents won 94% of the time between 2008 and 2025. But this next Tuesday, May 19th, you have two Democratic-backed lawmakers who are going to try to break that streak in Georgia. And whether you live here or not, you should care about how this goes. Because for a lot of the issues that people actually care about that affect day-to-day life, the federal courts, they've spent the last few years closing the door and shoving those questions back down to the states. Dobbes sent abortion back to the states, the Voting Rights Act's been gutted piece by piece, and the US Supreme Court's decision this year in Louisiana v. Calais, it effectively shut the federal courthouse on most redistricting challenges. So voting rights, privacy, bodily autonomy, how your district is drawn, increasingly, the question of who decides, it's not landing with the US Supreme Court, it's landing with your state Supreme Court. And that puts Georgia in a very interesting and important position right now. A lot of people don't know this. Every justice currently sitting on the Georgia Supreme Court, except one, was originally appointed by a Republican governor. And another thing that a lot of people don't know is that Georgia's state constitution actually has stronger protections than the US Constitution. Though these Republican appointees, they're part of why Georgia's 6-week abortion ban is still in effect. A ban that actually two of the justices that are being challenged voted to reinstate in 2024. But here's the thing, there is a playbook for changing all this. In Wisconsin, for example, voters spent 3 years flipping a 4-3 conservative state Supreme Court into a 5-2 liberal majority. And because of that, they've already thrown out Republican gerrymanders and restored ballot drop boxes. And while Georgia is not Wisconsin, do not get it confused, a playbook is still a playbook. And so this next Tuesday, you got 3 Georgia Supreme Court seats on the ballot. One incumbent, Justice Ben Land, he's running unopposed. But the other two, Justice Charlie Bethel, a former Republican state senator, and Justice Sarah Hawkins Warren, were both appointed in 2018 by Republican Governor Nathan Deal, and current Republican Governor Brian Kemp has endorsed both of them. And because this is such an important moment, I had their challengers as my guests today. You've got Miracle Rankin, who's a trial attorney who's built a career on catastrophic truck wrecks, medical malpractice, and corporate negligence cases, as well as Jen Jordan, who's a former Democratic state senator and the party's 2022 nominee for state attorney general. And with this, just a quick transparency thing. I think it is very important to be as transparent as possible, let you know where my biases land. I've already voted for both of them. Early voting here continues until Friday, and then election day is May 19th. So on Tuesday, that's the last chance you get. So one, there's that. And then two, of course, my wife, Lindsay DeFranco, is running for Georgia State House, District 47 here in Georgia. She's a born and raised Georgia girl. Our family has stake in what Georgia looks like moving forward. And I just personally find it important to be upfront about those things because I get really annoyed when people are like trying to be impartial and act like they have no personal opinions or feelings or they don't vote. And a final practical thing for my fellow Georgians out there. Again, early voting in Georgia ends this Friday. There is no runoff. There is no I'll just vote in November. And Tuesday, that's the whole race. Make a voting plan, double check everything at vote.org. Sometimes if you're doing early voting, it's a different place and when it's actually election day. But with that said, let's jump into it with Miracle Rankin and Jen Jordan. So Miracle, I'll say in a recent interview, you mentioned that the Georgia Constitution actually has more protections than the US Constitution. But we need a Georgia Supreme Court that reads it correctly. And Jen, you've said that while historically Georgia has a constitution that's been interpreted more expansively and progressively, the people on the court right now, they do not read it that way. So the first question that I have in mind, and I might have to tweak it, is what cases do you think that the Georgia Supreme Court got wrong and why?
So I'll jump in first. So this is a little bit of kind of a tight line, but in tightrope, I should say. So I'll just give one example for it, just to kind of lay it out there. The Georgia Supreme Court recognized a right of privacy decades before the U.S. Supreme Court did in Griswold versus Connecticut and Roe v. Wade. And so for decades and decades, the Georgia Supreme Court has recognized a right of privacy. And so when we talk about the Georgia Supreme Court and probably the Georgia Constitution being more progressive, that's the way it has been interpreted in the past by prior iterations of the court. We have not seen that in probably the last 20 years in terms of the approach that's been taken by the current members of the court. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's one of those things where we can't necessarily get into specific questions that may come before the court because obviously the right of privacy and that question around specifically Georgia's 6-week abortion ban is still a live controversy and will be coming back up to the Georgia Supreme Court at some point in time.
Well, okay, so then I'll ask you, Miracle, if we're speaking more generally, how do you think that this current makeup of the court is deciding cases?
The current makeup of the court is deciding cases in a more conservative leaning fashion, more in line with what does the U.S. Constitution provide as opposed to what does the Georgia Constitution provides. You can look at the U.S. Constitution as being like the floor, the rights that are the basic rights that we're guaranteed to, where Georgia is more of a ceiling. So we have more rights, such as the right to privacy that Jen spoke about a moment ago, which has been a right that's been recognized in Georgia well before it was recognized in other states. So right now, what we're seeing is a court that is more conservative leaning and trying to read both constitutions line in line, as opposed to recognizing that Georgia actually provides us with more.
And I feel like y'all have been warning about what is coming down the line to the Georgia Supreme Court. And while I know you cannot prejudge a case, the way I'll phrase it is, what do you think is most concerning to Georgians of what could be upcoming?
What's top of mind, obviously, is redistricting, right? And the Voting Rights Act, which was basically neutered by the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's what's really interesting, and not prejudging at all, but those challenges to maps and districting are now going to be coming to the state courts. You know, for years, really, those challenges have gone to the federal courts because they were always brought under the Voting Rights Act, which is a federal statute. That makes sense, right? So the Georgia courts really have not had to tangle with those issues in terms of how should the maps be drawn? Are there any parameters or guide rails? You know, how far can legislators go, especially when you're talking about impacting people's right to vote? And so that is definitely going to be coming up in terms of Georgia courts, because now that the federal court, and specifically the U.S. Supreme Court, has basically shut the door to the courthouse, the federal courthouse, for those challenges, really the only recourse that people will have are going to be state courts. And those challenges will ultimately make their way up to the Supreme Court. So that's going to open up a whole new area, really, of case law and precedent that really will be kind of continuing forward and really impact, you know, politically, what is this state going to look like, and how important is the right to vote in this state, and are we going to protect it or are we not?
And Phil, may I add that in going across the state and speaking with Georgians, one thing that I've been hearing a lot of concern about is people are now starting to kind of zone in on the fact that federal rights, or protections that we believed we had, are being taken away, right? And so now they're seeing that it's having a ripple effect. So I think people are just concerned in general about what will our state look like as more federal protections get stripped away. So rights in general, I think, are at the forefront of Georgians, be it your voting rights, your right to privacy, you know, right to who you want to love and marry.
It's really whatever you care about, right? Mm-hmm. That's Miracle. That's basically what you're saying. Whatever you care about is at issue in this election, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I think is most concerning to Georgians right now, is realizing that that baseline that we thought we had an understanding about from a federal protection perspective is now being slowly pulled back. And so people are like, well, what's going to happen next? What will be sent to the states next for each state to individually decide? And I think that'll have a huge impact ultimately on where people choose to stay, to live, to raise their families.
And these next set of questions will probably be somewhat tied together, because I do think that a lot of people are going to be interested in, you know, what can you say to voters who want to know where you stand on, let's say, reproductive rights first?
Well, you know, we can talk about our personal belief systems. Mm-hmm. Look, I have a pretty long record in terms of my beliefs. I've always believed, because it was what the U.S. Supreme Court said, which was women had a fundamental right to autonomy and to making the most private decisions when it comes to their bodies and their families and their health. That doesn't just go away, you know, just because, you know, 4 dudes said it should or whatever. I mean, you know, a fundamental right is a fundamental right. And from my perspective, that's my core belief, that, you know, that I should be able to have control over my body, especially when it comes to the most private decision making. And definitely my daughter should. I mean, she's 17 years old, and, you know, it's just a scary thing. And I know Miracle kind of feels the same way. I mean, she has a daughter as well.
I will add to that, Phil, that I'm a breast cancer survivor. I'm celebrating 10 years this year, and it truly is a celebration because it was a very tough journey to get to the other side of it. And so women's healthcare in general, and making tough decisions, I know what that feels like, having to have had to make those tough decisions with my own healthcare. And I personally believe that one should be able to make decisions about their healthcare with their God, their doctor, and with their self. Those are your personal decisions that affect your life. And so those are my personal beliefs. I do have a daughter. She's 4 years old. And it's a bit astonishing to me that my 4-year-old is growing up in a world now where she has less rights than what I was born into. And when you think about just rights in general for women, my generation is really the only generation of women that have had our whole slate of rights afforded to us. And now we're at a point where we're starting to see some of those rights where it looks like we're regressing as opposed to progressing forward in time. And that's a bit concerning.
And so I wanted to hear from that because I want to pair it to this other thing that this whole race has kind of turned into, which is you have people highlighting that, you know, you have these personal opinions and these takes, and it does feel like Republicans and certain figures are trying to make that disqualifying, that you're humans that also are in this position rather than kind of just a name on a piece of paper. You have Chief Justice John Roberts recently saying, you know, the Supreme Court judges are not political actors, you know, saying decisions might be unpopular, but they're based on the Constitution. Jen, your opponent kind of said it in a different way in a recent interview, said as a judge, she really tries to, quote, stay in her lane, which some have taken as saying you or y'all should stay in your lanes. And so my initial question is, what do you say to that? And also, what do you say to the argument that people in this position are political actors, or you are, or anyone is?
This is what's been interesting through this process. I think when a court, especially Chief Justice Roberts, said, you know, they're not political actors. Look, they may not be political actors in the sense, especially at the U.S. Supreme Court level, they don't run for office, right? That is different here in this state. But the U.S. Supreme Court, they don't run for office, but the decisions that they make absolutely have political impact, whether we're talking about the VRA, redistricting, whatever. And I think, you know, all we have to do is look at what happened at the Virginia Supreme Court level, where we literally had a statewide election invalidated by 4 members of the Virginia Supreme Court who were appointed by Republicans, right? 4 people. Because they were appointed by Republicans who had a specific ideology, basically turned around a fair and free election for the entire state of Virginia. So when folks try to say, you just need to stay in your lane, I want to say, I know exactly what the lane is. And the thing is, if people aren't willing and able to talk about their belief systems and their values, you may want to ask yourself, why is that, right? Why aren't people willing to answer questions, especially when they're standing for elections? It would be a very different thing if this weren't an elective process where you have to go before the voters and tell them, this is why you should vote for me. Because look, if you can't talk about your beliefs, your values, who you are, what your experience is, then how is a voter able to make a meaningful choice? I mean, like on the ballot, is it going to be like, well, I like the name Jen versus the other woman, or she's a redhead and you're a blonde? That makes absolutely no sense. So it's one of those things where if you have to stand for election, there's a reason for it. And that reason is you have to be accountable to the voters. And the only way you can be accountable to the voters is to be able to talk about what your judicial philosophy is, what your belief system is. And if you have made some decisions, you have to be able to you know, stand up and kind of say, this is why I did it. And then if people like that, great, they can vote for you. And if they don't, they can vote for the challenger.
And Miracle, I mean, your opponent specifically is, a former Republican state senator. So do you think people that are throwing out this argument, they're being short-sighted or hypocritical?
I do think that they're being short-sighted and hypocritical. Everyone's record speaks for themselves, right? So one thing that I have been urging individuals to do is just to look us up. You can look up what he did before he came onto the court to be a judge. You can also look at what my career has been. My career has been one of serving the people of this state at the highest level and going after big corporations who harmed them in some of the hardest moments of their lives. I think it's vitally important that individuals know who you're voting for. You shouldn't just vote just to do it. It needs to be a meaningful vote, right? And one way for people to know who they're voting for is to have these types of conversations and discourses, the same way that they're interviewing with individuals and talking at a very high level, not getting into the weeds of their personal beliefs. They actually can talk about their personal beliefs. There's nothing that stops judicial candidates or sitting judges from talking about what you personally believe. Because as a judge, you should be able to, and you're supposed to be able to separate that from the cases that come before you and not prejudging a matter, right? And so they should know that talking about your personal beliefs does not equate to prejudging a case that will come before the court. But a lot of times people don't want to talk about their personal beliefs because it may not be in line with what the electorate feels is most important. So I think that it's important that we have these conversations, that people get pushed to be able to tell Georgians, what do you believe about important matters?
And an important matter that y'all have brought up, I mean, how would you say Louisiana v. Calais is going to impact your job as a state Supreme Court judge?
So I will take that first, that I'm from Louisiana. That's where I was originally born and stayed until I was in high school when I moved to Georgia. And I was a bit saddened to just see what the federal court did in Calais. And what we've seen now is a big scramble. I have a lot of family members in the state who have been trying to figure out what will elections look like for years to come. And so now we know that that's going to ultimately come to Georgia with what the special session that Governor Kemp calls this week. And so it will be a matter of seeing what our legislature ultimately does. That's when those three branches of government really start to come into play, right? You have the legislative, the executive, and ultimately the judicial branch. So right now it's going through two branches of government, the legislative, then ultimately the executive. And at some point it will land at the judicial branch. And that will be based upon what the facts of the case are at that time and what the law and our Constitution says. And so I think it's vitally important that we know who the judges are on the court that will be ultimately handling and deciding those cases. And
I do want to ask, I mean, do you see y'all's candidacy and getting elected as kind of a step one to a larger plan to hopefully even out the Georgia Supreme Court? Because I imagine you have to a certain degree, hedge expectations. Because if you both get elected and the likely makeup of would be considered, I know that there's no D's and R's in front of the names, but would be kind of seen 6-3 conservative. Is this kind of the first step to 2028 where three of Kemp's appointees all of a sudden come up for reelection and all of a sudden Georgia could actually see a much different Supreme Court in 2028? Do you see that as kind of like, I don't know if you would say the vision or the goal?
Well, I think it's definitely within reach. Let me say that. It's one of those things where, look, a lot of people have pushed back on Miracle and I for running. This was not, people weren't very happy about it. I'll have to say that. You just don't do this. I mean, that's what we were told. You don't run against a sitting Supreme Court justice. It's not just done. And I'm sure you've heard that it hasn't even successfully been done since 1922. And it's definitely not been done by two women who just, who's taken the last 3 months to really try to take on the system. Look, I look at it as kind of, we're going in, we're doing this because we think it's the right thing. We think it's necessary. And if we're successful, or even if one of us is successful, or even if we're not successful, I think that we've really put a marker out there in terms of this is something that can be done and should be done because it's absolutely necessary in light of what's happening at the U.S. Supreme Court level. And we know it can be done because all we have to do is look at Wisconsin, where they took a 5-2 far right conservative, I don't even know conservative is the word, court. And within 3 years, it's a 5-2 pro-democracy, pro-rights court. It's pretty impressive. And that really is having a positive impact on the people of the state of Wisconsin. So it's a good role model. And, we'll see what happens on Tuesday. And we'll see if anybody else wants to kind of jump into the fray in 2 years.
That is something that I've heard y'all talking about, of people not being happy about it, and I'm just personally interested in that. Is it a bit of a club of, I'm going to step on toes and this may affect me in the legal profession?
Oh, it's
Yeah.
a club.
Essentially, it really is, and it's very disheartening because ultimately our state's highest court belongs to the people of Georgia. It's not a birthright position. It's not a position based upon who you know, where you live, and what your connections are. It's a position of service, and service at the highest level to our state. And to have individuals be so off-put by the fact that two very qualified candidates are offering ourselves a service and giving the opportunity back to Georgians to elect an individual to be on your highest court is very concerning. And I think that if for anything else, we are shining a light on the importance of following our Constitution. Our Constitution calls for these to be elected positions. They are not by appointment only. And so Georgians get to decide at a vital time, who do you want to serve on our state's highest court?
And one of the last things I want to ask, I mean, Miracle, your opponent said that they will stay in their position, but Jen, I believe your opponent has been silent, and you kind of expressed concern that they will drop out if they lose, and then Kemp will just put someone into the spot and kind of just cancel your election. Is that a real concern right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real concern in the fact that Justice Warren has really refused to, say just what should be a very easy thing, which is I'll finish out my term and I will abide by the results of the election. I know Miracle and I are going to abide by the results of the election if we lose, right? It doesn't seem like a very hard thing just to say that in a very straightforward way. So the fact that she isn't, willing to say that or to answer questions around that is incredibly concerning to me, because the idea that someone thinks that they can just really basically overturn the results of a fair and free election just because they don't like the outcome, should be incredibly concerning to every single voter in the state of Georgia.
I mean, the undoing the willing of the will of the people seems to be going around more and more.
Seems to be the theme, right?
It's getting scary. But on that final note, obviously one of the biggest things with us talking is early voting ends this Friday, but it is all Tuesday, right? It's all the 19th. You're not running in November. I know that's been a big thing of people going, oh, I'll vote in November. It's all Tuesday, right?
Yes, all or nothing. We're all done on Tuesday.
Miracle, Jen, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Phil. This was awesome.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.